Feeding tubes are wonderful inventions which help thousands of people every day to obtain nutrition. However, for me, feeding tubes have almost cost me my life. In 2010, I went to a large medical clinic because I lost a lot of weight. They did extensive testing which discovered my intestines did not function properly. I was given a nasojejunal feeding tube. This is a feeding tube which goes up the nose, down the throat, through the stomach, and into the small intestine. I was started on feeding tube formula. About 10 days later, I had a procedure to place a feeding tube directly into my small intestines. As much as I hoped the feeding tube would help me, it did not. I soon became extremely sick. My joints hurt. I had a headache. I had absolutely no energy. My body felt as though it had been run over by a train. I then started throwing up the feeding tube formula. This was quite a feat because the feeding tube formula had to travel from my small intestine into my stomach and then up my esophagus and out my mouth. I was rapidly losing weight. I contacted the dietitian at the medical clinic. We tried switching to different formulas, but all formula made me sick. I went back to the large medical clinic. Unfortunately, my doctor had left. A doctor who was still in her training years became my physician. The doctor did not believe I was throwing up my formula. She told me I had an eating disorder. She threatened if I did not eat, she'd place an intravenous line and give me IV nutrition. I said, "Yes, please, do whatever you need to do. I am going to die. I cannot eat, and this feeding tube formula is making me sick." The physician's anger flared when I begged to be placed on IV nutrition. The doctor referred me on to the psychiatric department. I was told all my GI issues were psychological. I went home and begged God for answers. I found a different medical clinic. I prayed over and over for God to lead me to the right doctor. I was going to die if no one intervened quickly. I called the clinic. 2 days later, I had an appointment with one of the most amazing people I have ever met. The doctor told me it did not matter if I was or was not a psychiatric case. I needed nutrition now. I was going to die. I was severely malnourished and dehydrated. The doctor gave me 2 liters of IV fluids in her office. The next day, I was able to get a permanent intravenous line called a PICC line. I immediately began IV fluids. Shortly thereafter, I also began receiving IV nutrition called TPN. My health quickly did a complete turnaround. My constant nausea, vomiting, diffuse pain in my body, and feeling as though I had been run over by a train disappeared. I finally felt human again. During this time, I did a total elimination diet. It seemed as though all food made me sick. I then discovered I had become allergic to corn. The high levels of corn ingredients in the feeding tube formula had caused my body to develop a corn allergy. Since corn is in almost all food except plain fruits and vegetables, I stopped eating all food except fresh fruits and vegetables. I slowly found safe foods I could eat without becoming severely ill. I was able to sustain myself eating by mouth and stopped receiving TPN. I struggled for many years to maintain my weight. I fought hard to eat by mouth. I soon learned I had chronic pancreatitis, which was causing my severe digestive issues. The pain I was experiencing were pancreatitis attacks. In 2017, I developed respiratory failure. I had to get a tracheostomy tube and be started on invasive ventilation. After getting a tracheostomy tube, I was given a nasogastric feeding tube. This is a feeding tube which goes up the nose, down the throat, and into the stomach. I told the medical staff I could not have feeding tube formula because almost all feeding tube formula has corn in it. I was promised the feeding tube formula I was going to be given did not have corn in it. However, within 12 hours of starting the feeding tube formula, I was screaming in pain and was starting to throw up. I was given a swallow test. When the speech therapist acknowledged I could swallow, I immediately got rid of the feeding tube and started back on my plain vegetable-based diet. It took several days, but soon the severe pain went away. In 2020, my pancreas began acting up. I could eat less and less food by mouth, and I was severely crippled by extreme pain in my pancreas. My GI doctor said the solution was a feeding tube. He scheduled me to have surgery to have a feeding tube placed. From the moment the feeding tube was inserted, I was extremely sick. I did not tolerate the feeding tube formula. I developed severe abdominal pain. The feeding tube kept twisting in my intestines and caused bowel obstructions. After experiencing all these complications, I had an appointment with my GI doctor, but he refused to listen to me. A feeding tube was the answer to me not being able to eat. There was no reason I could not tolerate the feeding tube or the feeding tube formula. Day after day, I was in agonizing pain. I was rapidly losing weight and my heart was failing. I prayed to God for help. My doctor's assistant called me to set up an appointment to get imaging done of my abdomen. I pleaded with the assistant for help. He contacted the on-call doctor. I was told to come into the hospital immediately. During my time in the emergency department, I begged God to show the doctors I needed IV nutrition. I could not tolerate this feeding tube. And praise be to God, the doctors at the hospital listened. My blood work showed I was severely malnourished. They started me on IV nutrition. After being released home, I was able to have the feeding tube removed. I cannot tell you the relief it was to have the feeding tube out of my intestine. It took a few days, but my intestines finally stopped spasming and causing severe pain. Those have been my experiences with feeding tubes. I hope I never have to have a feeding tube again. I am currently on IV nutrition and I pray a future doctor does not decide a feeding tube is a solution to my pancreas issues. Thank you so much for joining me. Please remember to like and subscribe down below. I hope you have a great day and a wonderful week. Happy Feeding Tube Awareness Week. Bye-bye. People often ask me, wouldn't it be easier to have a feeding tube instead of having an IV line and have TPN? My answer is no. I absolutely love my IV line and TPN. I have really bad veins and my IV line affords me easy IV access, especially in the emergency department and in the hospital. Also, I have postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. I get dehydrated very quickly and I often need IV fluids. When I have TPN, this guarantees me I get 2 liters of IV fluids every day. So my POTS has been very stable, which I'm very, very grateful for. Also, I have hypoglycemia, which is low blood sugar. My blood sugar seems to go very, very low whenever I leave my home or do any sort of exertion. So having the TPN is very beneficial. As soon as I feel my blood sugar starting to drop, I quickly get my TPN out, hook it up, and within 30 minutes, my blood sugar has stabilized. This has been a lifesaver for me. So I absolutely love my TPN and I just praise God every day for it. I'm so blessed.